Hi, my name is Alex, and in today's video, I'll examine the worst mountain deaths ever recorded. From a woman who risked everything for a photograph, then a gust of wind threw her, to a kid who was forced by his parents to climb the deadliest peak. I'm taking you first to August 12th, 2015, Midway Geyser Basin, Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. The boardwalk was filling steadily with visitors by late morning, the air sitting around 62 degrees Fahrenheit, steam venting low across the ground from the thermal features surrounding the path. It looks like a nature documentary set, which, for me, honestly is a big part of why it's so dangerous. When I first read through this case, the thing that caught me wasn't the death itself. It was how ordinary the morning looked, right up until it wasn't. Let me walk you through what I found. Gavin Mertz, 26, from Denver, Colorado, had graduated from college roughly 2 months before the trip. He and a close friend had planned a road trip through the American West as a post-graduation milestone. Yellowstone was the second stop on the route. No prior wilderness experience. Never visited a national park at this scale. People who knew him described him as physically confident and consistently willing to push into new situations without fully reading them first. Not reckless in any dramatic sense, he just didn't slow down long enough to assess what was actually in front of him. And honestly, that's not something most people would look at and think, yeah, that's a red flag. They had been on the boardwalk loop for approximately 35 minutes. Gavin had been photographing the thermal features the entire time, frequently leaning over the railing to get lower angles on the water surface. I get why someone does that. The Grand Prismatic Spring has these rings of color going from deep blue at the center, out through turquoise and green at the edges, fading into amber and brown where the microbial mats thin out, and it genuinely doesn't look like something that kills you. What I can't get past is that multiple posted signs along that same route were saying the exact opposite the entire time. Thin crust, superheated water, stay on the path. Water temperatures in Midway Basin features sit between 147 degrees Fahrenheit and 188 degrees Fahrenheit. That information was physically posted on signs he walked past to get there. Gavin's friend noted he had already reached past the railing on at least 2 earlier occasions during the walk. A park ranger had done a routine pass through the area 18 minutes before the incident. The area where Gavin eventually stepped off was venting visible steam directly from the ground. And when I read that detail, I had to stop, because that's not subtle. That's the ground actively telling you something is wrong underneath it. At that section of the boardwalk, there was a maintenance access break in the railing, an opening that staff used to step off the boardwalk with equipment. No physical block on it, no barrier, nothing distinguishing it from a gap a visitor might walk straight through. That gap had been there long before Gavin's trip. When I found that in the incident report, it bothered me more than almost anything else in this story, because the railing was never broken. It was just never properly closed off to the public. Gavin stepped through the gap and moved toward a smaller thermal pool approximately 15 feet from the boardwalk edge. The surface crust in that area consisted of between 1 and 2 inches of silica and mineral deposit over actively circulating hydrothermal water, thin enough that it gives no indication of instability from above. Within 4 to 5 steps, it fractured beneath his weight. No audible creak, no visible shift beforehand. He broke through and submerged to at least waist depth before the surrounding crust arrested any further sinking. Water temperature at that location was later measured at approximately 178 degrees Fahrenheit, with chemistry consistent with the high silica, acidic environment of the broader Midway Basin. At those temperatures, and the pH, thermal and chemical injury begin compounding from the moment of contact. There is no survivable version of full torso immersion in that water. I've read that in a few different reports now, and it doesn't get easier to read. His friend witnessed the moment the crust gave way and ran immediately toward the nearest ranger contact point. Rangers reached the site within 11 minutes. A physical recovery attempt was halted. Water temperature made entry impossible without specialized equipment that wasn't on site. The formal recovery operation was conducted the following morning. Partial remains were recovered from the pool's edge and the surrounding crust area. I'll just say the word partial in that report is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Cause of death was confirmed as thermal scalding and chemical injuries consistent with immersion in superheated, highly acidic water. Ruled accidental. The unguarded maintenance gap was identified as a direct contributing factor and was physically blocked within 48 hours of the incident. 48 hours. After Gavin, they closed the gap. That's the thing about prevention. It almost always comes after, never before. It was January 14th, 2018. Railay Beach, a place where limestone karsts rise straight out of the jungle floor, and where the gap between tourist attraction and technical climbing venue has never been clearly defined. By mid-morning, heat was pressing down on the narrow beach strip, the air thick with salt and humidity. Jonas Kradl was 28 years old, and he had less than 2 minutes left. Jonas was a backpacker from Bremen, 6 weeks into a planned 6-month trip across Southeast Asia. Back home, he worked as a warehouse logistics coordinator, a job he'd held for 3 years, specifically to save for this trip. At a small indoor climbing facility near his apartment, other climbers who knew him said that he'd completed a handful of beginner sessions, enough to feel competent on plastic holds, but not nearly enough for outdoor rock. Friends described him as determined, the kind of person who planned obsessively and underestimated almost nothing, except, on this morning, the wall in front of him. He reached the eastern beach wall at 11:15 a.m., where a vertical face laced with tufas rose roughly 80 feet above a field of broken limestone blocks. In this section, the protrusions climbers call tufas are fragile calcite columns formed over time as mineral-rich water deposits calcite along the rock surface, often leaving hollow interiors that appear solid but break easily under outward load. Guided groups use this section regularly, though this particular line carried no fixed bolts and was generally avoided by instructors because of unstable protrusions and the broken blocks at its base. Jonas wore sandals, carried no harness or helmet, and told nearby resting climbers he only wanted to go up a short distance. Several of those climbers began filming almost immediately, not to intervene, though warnings were called out, but because the situation was the kind that draws phones out instinctively. One person filming from roughly 15 feet away on the beach, another standing on a limestone boulder to the right, and a third farther down the wall, all had their phones raised as Jonas began climbing. Jonas climbed in a deliberate, if technically poor style, relying heavily on his arms, pulling upward rather than driving through his legs. He moved past the 30-foot mark without incident. At 50 feet, he was high enough that the angle of the rock face below him was nearly vertical, and the limestone blocks at the base were no longer a survivable landing surface. He reached for a tufa column, roughly 8 inches across, projecting from the wall at chest height, and wrapped his right arm around it. The footage shows a single upward pull, his full body weight loaded outward and upward on the formation simultaneously. That combination of forces, applied to a hollow calcite structure bonded only at its base, is precisely how tufas fail. Witnesses on the ground heard a sharp crack an instant before the column separated from the wall completely. Jonas came off the face with the formation. There was no interval, no attempt to grab anything else. The fall was direct and vertical, 50 feet, covered in under 2 seconds. His back and head contacted the limestone block cluster at the base first. The sound of impact carried on at least 3 separate recordings. The tufa column struck the rock surface beside him almost simultaneously with the impact. He did not move after landing. Climbers at the base reached him within seconds. His skull had partially deformed on the right side, and blood spread rapidly across the white rock surface beneath his head. Bystanders checked for breathing and a pulse but detected neither. Because of the obvious catastrophic head trauma and the possibility of a severe spinal injury, they did not attempt to move his body while waiting for help. A nearby guide called emergency services at 11:33 a.m. Local responders later arrived by boat roughly 20 minutes after the call. No intervention was possible in the interim. Jonas died from blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall of approximately 50 feet onto hard, irregular terrain. The examination documented a fractured cervical spine at the C2 to C3 level, along with severe traumatic brain injury, including a skull fracture and extensive cerebral hemorrhage, injuries consistent with death occurring immediately on impact. Local climbing guides placed temporary warning signs near the wall in the days that followed, noting unstable tufa formations along the route. The wall itself was not closed. Jonas's parents traveled from Germany to handle repatriation of his remains. A notebook recovered from his pack at the base of the wall still contained 3 months of detailed travel plans written in his handwriting. It was April 22, 2017, and Everest Base Camp at 17,600 feet hummed with the tense energy of early spring season. 14 commercial expeditions occupied the glacier, their tents clustered by company across broken ice that groaned and shifted beneath the weight of everything built on top of it. Prayer flags snapped in wind that carried the sharp mineral scent of glacial ice mixed with juniper smoke from morning pujas. Temperatures hovered near 18 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, climbing into the low 30s by midday as sunlight pooled in the basin below. Generators droned from mess tents. Radios crackled with route updates from the icefall doctors working above. About 280 climbers occupied base camp that season, spread across teams ranging from elite alpine operations to budget outfits selling summit dreams at varying price points. Among those preparing for the first summit window was a family of 3 from Boulder, Colorado, who had attracted quiet attention from other expeditions since arriving 5 days earlier. Kevin Torrance was 45 years old, 6'2", and built like someone who had never fully left competitive athletics behind. He had wrestled at the University of Colorado, transitioned into corporate consulting, and discovered mountaineering in his early 30s. The sport consumed him the way wrestling once had, completely, structurally, as if altitude were simply another opponent that could be defeated through preparation and refusal to quit. His resume included Denali twice, Aconcagua, Elbrus, and Cho Oyu in 2015, where he summited without supplemental oxygen. He approached mountains the way he approached everything else, with investment, research, and an expectation of return. His wife, Laura Torrance, was 43, a former competitive triathlete who had placed in the top 20 at 2 Ironman World Championships before chronic knee tendonitis redirected her toward mountaineering. She was lean and disciplined in a way that made other climbers assume she belonged anywhere she showed up. Her transition to altitude had been deliberate. Kilimanjaro first, then Denali alongside Kevin, then Aconcagua and Cho Oyu in the same seasons he climbed them. What was less obvious was that her body, tuned over decades for sea-level endurance, had responded inconsistently to extreme altitude. On Cho Oyu, her oxygen saturation had dipped lower than Kevin's at the same camps, and her recovery between efforts took noticeably longer. She attributed it to poor sleep and moved on. The pattern had never been tested above 26,000 feet. Together, they had built a social media following of roughly 40,000 centered on the brand of an adventure family that climbed together and measured its bonds through shared suffering. Laura managed the content while Kevin provided the vision. The Everest expedition was their most ambitious project, partially funded by $30,000 in sponsorship. The posts leading up to departure had framed the climb as a family promise, a milestone marking their son's 18th birthday. Their son, Ethan Torrance, had turned 18 3 weeks before arriving in Nepal. He was 5'11", lean from years of training he hadn't chosen, and quiet in a way people might mistake for shyness. He had been climbing since he was 10, not because he asked to, but because his parents signed him up. Rainier at 12, Kilimanjaro at 14, Aconcagua at 17. Every peak on his resume had been selected by Kevin, scheduled by Laura, and completed by Ethan with the mechanical competence of someone trained rather than inspired. At base camp, the difference was visible. Kevin moved between mess tents, introducing himself to expedition leaders, asking detailed questions about route conditions and fixed rope status. Laura documented everything with a practiced eye for angles and lighting. Ethan sat outside his tent with his hood up, earbuds in, watching the glacier without expression. He didn't socialize with other climbers. He didn't ask questions during briefings. When other team members tried conversation, his answers were short and flat, delivered with the politeness of someone raised to be courteous, but who had nothing he wanted to share. The family's primary Sherpa was Jangbu Sonam, 36, from a small settlement near Tame in the upper Solukhumbu. He had summited Everest 9 times over 12 seasons, working his way from porter to high-altitude guide through physical resilience and calm professionalism that expedition operators valued above almost everything else. His income supported his wife, 2 young daughters, and his mother, whose declining health required medications that consumed a growing share of his earnings. The $8,000 fee for the Torrance assignment, split with a younger assistant named Nima Charing, represented his primary income for the year. The expedition briefing on April 24th set the tone for everything that followed. The expedition leader, an American guide named Paul Vickers, gathered 12 clients and walked through the route, acclimatization schedule, and turnaround protocols. He stressed that Sherpa guidance above Camp 3 was directive, not advisory. Kevin sat near the front and asked pointed questions about oxygen flow rates, about whether turnaround times could be adjusted for faster climbers, about whether teams reaching the balcony ahead of schedule could push beyond standard cutoffs. The questions signaled he viewed protocols as starting points rather than rules. Ethan sat at the back, arms crossed, staring at the floor. At one point, Kevin turned and told him to sit up and pay attention, in a tone that silenced the tent. After the briefing, Kevin approached Giang Bu to discuss the family's expectations. He explained that the climb represented something larger than a single summit. It was the defining event of their family's legacy, and he expected support to match that significance. Giang Bu listened and replied that his priority was ensuring all three returned safely. Kevin acknowledged this and immediately redirected to summit logistics. That evening during dinner, Kevin described Ethan's climbing history to another team with the fluency of someone who had told the story many times. He called Ethan a natural climber, said the mountains were in his blood. Laura added that the summit was the completion of a promise the whole family shared. Ethan sat beside them and said nothing. His expression didn't change. A climber from another team later mentioned to Giang Bu that the kid looked like he was attending a funeral. The first rotation through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet began on April 27th. The family departed at 4 in the morning, headlamps cutting through darkness. Kevin set a strong pace, moving with confidence through the maze of seracs, crevasses, and aluminum ladders. Laura climbed efficiently behind him. Ethan moved between them and Giang Bu, technically sound but entirely passive, clipping in when told, stepping where directed. His movements were practiced and correct. They were also empty. At the first major ladder crossing, Kevin paused on the far side and watched Ethan cross with an evaluating stare. When Ethan's crampon placement wavered slightly on the third rung, Kevin corrected him immediately, loudly enough that climbers behind them heard the sharpness. The correction was technically valid. The delivery made another guide on the rope look away. Ethan adjusted his feet without responding. At Camp 1, Giang Bu checked saturations. Kevin registered 81%. Laura showed 76, lower than her husband at the same altitude, consistent with Cho Oyu. She waved it off, attributing the number to dehydration. Ethan measured 79, solidly within range, but accompanied by none of the relief or satisfaction most climbers showed when their numbers came back acceptable. The second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,200 feet on May 1st exposed the first cracks. The western CWM stretched for miles across hidden crevasses, reflected sunlight turning the glacial basin into a furnace by mid-morning. Laura's pace dropped noticeably, her breathing shallow even during rest breaks. She reached Camp 2 nearly 40 minutes behind Kevin, who had pushed ahead without waiting. Her oxygen saturation read 72%. Giang Bu recommended she spend an extra night before attempting the Lhotse face. Kevin dismissed the suggestion before Laura could respond, stating the schedule existed for a reason and deviating would disrupt the family's timeline. Laura backed him up, insisting she felt better than the numbers indicated. That afternoon, Ethan sat alone outside on a flat rock overlooking the CWM. Giang Bu brought him tea and sat nearby without speaking. After several minutes, Ethan asked about Giang Bu's daughters, what they were like, how old they were. It was the first time Giang Bu had heard him speak more than a few words unprompted. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes before Kevin emerged from the gear tent and called Ethan over to help sort equipment. Ethan stood without finishing his tea and went. That evening, Laura uploaded a video from Camp 2, the family's tents with the Lhotse face gleaming behind them, narrated with captions about the adventure of a lifetime and the power of family. The post tagged sponsors and included a clip of Kevin and Ethan walking the CWM that Laura had filmed from behind. The caption described the climb as something the whole family had dreamed about together, The word together appeared 3 times. The third rotation to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet on May 5th was where the situation shifted from concerning to alarming. The Lhotse face rose at angles between 40 and 50 degrees. Sustained blue ice demanding rhythmic crampon work, fixed rope technique, and cardiovascular output at altitudes where every system in the body was degrading. Ethan climbed the face in silence, his movements increasingly mechanical. He stopped looking up at the route. He stopped adjusting his rhythm to the terrain. He simply moved. Step, breathe, step, breathe, with the automation of someone who had disconnected from the experience entirely. Jiangbu climbed behind him, watching a capable young man move through technical terrain with the enthusiasm of someone serving a sentence. Laura struggled more visibly. Her breathing was labored from the first 100 feet of the face, her rest stops longer than during previous rotations, her crampon work less precise as fatigue accumulated. She stopped twice without warning, clinging to the fixed rope with her head bowed and chest heaving. Kevin climbed above and called down encouragement that sounded more like instructions, telling her to regulate her breathing, lift her knees, keep moving. At Camp 3, Laura measured 68% on supplemental oxygen, a significant drop that confirmed the pattern Jiangbu had tracked since Camp 1. He explained that her acclimatization was not improving and that continuing higher increased the risk of pulmonary or cerebral edema, conditions that could progress to incapacitation and death within hours above 26,000 feet. Kevin responded that Laura had experienced similar numbers on Cho Oyu and summited without incident, and that higher oxygen flow rates on summit day would compensate for her lower baseline. Jiangbu countered that Cho Oyu's summit was over 2,000 feet lower, with a shorter, less technical route and a wider margin for error. Kevin thanked him for the input and said the family would discuss it privately. That evening, Jiangbu found Ethan alone and asked him directly whether he wanted to continue climbing. The answer came without hesitation and without drama. Ethan told him that he had never wanted to do any of this, that his parents had decided when he was 10 that climbing was what the family did, and that saying no had never been an option that changed anything. He delivered this flatly, without self-pity or anger, in the tone of someone reporting facts he had accepted long ago. Jiangbu raised the issue with Vickers via radio, Laura's declining saturation, and Ethan's stated unwillingness to continue. Vickers radioed Kevin directly. Kevin's response was immediate. Laura was managing fine and would improve with rest. Regarding Ethan, Kevin explained that his son had expressed similar reluctance on Aconcagua and Cho Oyu, and summited both without incident, nerves early that resolved once the real climbing began. He described it as a pattern. Laura supported Kevin's assessment, adding that Ethan had always been anxious before big climbs and that they knew their son better than anyone. Vickers followed protocol and spoke with Ethan directly. Jiangbu handed him the radio outside the family's tent, far enough that Kevin and Laura couldn't hear. Vickers asked whether Ethan wanted to continue or descend. Ethan paused, then said he was fine. 2 words, delivered without conviction, that technically constituted consent from a legal adult. Vickers documented the response and informed Jiangbu that absent a clear refusal or medical emergency, the expedition would proceed as planned. Jiangbu ended the conversation, knowing exactly what was going to happen and unable to prevent it. The weather window opened on May 17th. The Torrance family joined the summit push with 8 other clients, climbing through the established camps over 3 days. Laura moved on, diminishing reserves, pace slower than during rotations, appetite gone, face thinner than when she had arrived. They reached Camp 4 on the South Col at 26,000 feet on the afternoon of May 19th. Wind hammered the exposed plateau, flattening tents and driving spindrift across rocky terrain littered with debris from previous expeditions. Jiangbu performed final vital checks inside the family's tent. Kevin measured 71% on supplemental oxygen, low but functional. Ethan registered 70, similar range, his body performing as expected for a fit 18-year-old at extreme altitude. Laura's readings stopped Jiangbu cold, 61% at 4 liters per minute. At sea level, that number would prompt emergency hospitalization. At 26,000 feet, it represented severe hypoxia and a body that was failing to compensate despite every advantage available to it. Jiangbu explained what the number meant without softening it. Laura's oxygen processing had deteriorated at every camp since base camp. The pattern was consistent and worsening. Attempting the summit, 3,000 vertical feet above them through the most demanding terrain on the route, with her current numbers, was medically reckless. He recommended she descend immediately while she still had the capacity to walk down under her own power. Kevin rejected the recommendation before Laura finished hearing it. He argued she had been lower on Cho Oyu and recovered, that higher flow rates would compensate, and that turning around now would waste months of preparation and tens of thousands of dollars. Laura said nothing during the exchange, not agreement, not disagreement, just the silence of someone who had spent 20 years letting her husband make decisions in moments like this. Zhang Bu made one final attempt. While Kevin and Laura prepared gear, he sat with Ethan in the vestibule of the adjacent shelter and told him plainly that his mother's condition was dangerous and the summit push carried serious risk. He asked whether Ethan understood what could happen above this camp. Ethan looked at him and said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded. He understood. He also understood that nothing he said would change what was about to happen. Kevin's voice came from the next tent, telling Ethan to stop sitting around and start checking his oxygen system. Ethan stood up and the conversation ended. The summit push left Camp 4 at 11 p.m. under a clear sky dense with stars. Temperatures with wind chill sat near minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. The family climbed in a line, Kevin in front, Laura behind him, Ethan between Laura and Zhang Bu, with Nima Charing bringing up the rear. The first 2 hours passed without crisis. Kevin set a steady pace up the ridge, his fitness evident in his rhythm. Laura kept up through what appeared to be pure willpower, breathing audible through her mask. Rest stops slightly longer than Kevin's, but legs still moving. Ethan climbed mechanically between the Sherpas, his body performing the task his mind had checked out of hours ago. Zhang Bu tracked all three from behind, counting rest stop durations, listening to breathing patterns, watching for the small deviations that preceded bigger failures. Above the balcony at 27,600 feet, Laura's deterioration became visible to everyone on the rope, despite the supplemental oxygen flowing at 4 liters per minute. Her pace halved. Rest stops stretched from 45 seconds to 3 minutes. Her movements lost the precise economy that endurance athletes develop over decades and became loose, uncoordinated. Her crampon placement imprecise on terrain that punished imprecision with falls. She stumbled on a fixed rope transition and caught herself a full second late, an eternity on a ridge where the margin between recovery and a 2,000-foot fall was measured in fractions of moments. Her speech began to slur, words arriving slowly and collapsing into fragments. A faint wet rattle appeared in her breathing on every exhale, suggesting fluid was beginning to accumulate in her lungs. By 28,000 feet, 4.5 hours into the climb, Laura could no longer walk without physical support. Kevin braced her on one side, his arm around her harness, half guiding and half carrying her up terrain that demanded full concentration from climbers at peak capacity. Her legs moved, but without purpose. Her head drooped between steps. When Kevin spoke to her, she stared at him without recognition. Zhang Bu moved forward and told Kevin directly that Laura was exhibiting advanced cerebral edema, confusion, coordination loss, slurred speech, in a progression that would end in unconsciousness and death if they continued climbing. They needed to descend immediately, not in 30 minutes. Now. Kevin looked at his wife, looked at the ridge above, and told Zhang Bu they were close enough to push through. Laura just needed to rally the way she always had. Her body had been through worse during Ironman races, and she had never quit anything. Zhang Bu pointed out that Kevin had climbed Cho Oyu, that he had been above 8,000 meters and knew what altitude illness looked like, and that what he was seeing right now was not fatigue and would not resolve with effort. Kevin paused, then said they were continuing. Ethan spoke. For the first time in the entire expedition, he directly and clearly asked to go down, not for himself, but for his mother. He told his father something was wrong with her, and they needed to stop. Kevin told him not to start this now, that they hadn't come this far as a family to fall apart when it mattered, and that his mother was tougher than he was giving her credit for. The words landed on Ethan like a door closing. He didn't speak again. They continued for another 45 minutes. At approximately 28,400 feet, Laura collapsed. Her legs buckled without warning, and she dropped into the snow, with Kevin still gripping her harness. She did not attempt to stand. She did not respond to Kevin's voice. Her breathing continued, shallow, wet, labored, but her eyes were closed and her body had gone slack. The cerebral edema had progressed past the point of function. Kevin's reaction was immediate and irrational. He tried to lift her. He adjusted her oxygen mask, turned the regulator to maximum flow, and attempted to drag her upward by the harness. When Jiang Bu told him to stop, Kevin turned on him with a ferocity that altitude could not fully explain, telling him they were not leaving her, that she needed to get to the summit because she would never forgive them if they turned around this close. His wife was dying in front of him, and his response was to believe the summit could still happen. Jiang Bu gave Kevin a direct instruction to begin descending, and made clear he was taking Ethan down, regardless of what Kevin decided. Kevin refused to leave Laura. He knelt beside her in the snow, adjusting her hood, checking her mask, talking to her as if she could hear him, and would stand up if he found the right words. Jiang Bu asked him 3 more times. Each time Kevin shook his head without looking up. Jiang Bu told Nima to remain at a safe distance, monitor Kevin and Laura, and radio Camp 4 for any available support. Then he turned to Ethan and began the descent. Ethan followed without resistance, moving downward with the same mechanical obedience he had shown going up, except now his movements were slower and clumsier, his body depleted, and his mind somewhere that Jiang Bu couldn't reach. The descent through the dark was grueling. Ethan's coordination deteriorated as hypoxia and shock compounded, his steps uncertain on terrain that required precision. At the fixed rope section below the balcony, around 27,400 feet, his crampon caught on a rock outcrop, and he pitched forward without warning. Jiang Bu lunged to arrest the fall, bracing his right leg against the slope and catching the rope with both hands as Ethan's full weight hit the tether. The impact wrenched Jiang Bu's right knee sideways with a sound he felt more than heard. A deep, structural shift that sent pain radiating from his kneecap to his hip. He held the arrest. Ethan swung into the slope face first, his left arm striking rock at an angle that produced an audible crack. His outer glove tore free and tumbled into the darkness below. Jiang Bu pulled Ethan back onto the road through pain that narrowed his vision to a tunnel. Ethan's left arm hung at an angle that confirmed a fracture, and his exposed left hand was already losing color in the -35-degree wind chill. Jiang Bu removed his own inner glove liner and forced it onto Ethan's bare hand, an imperfect solution that slowed the frostbite but couldn't stop it entirely. His own fingers, now exposed inside only the outer shell, began losing sensation within minutes. They reached Camp 4 before dawn with the help of 2 climbers from another team who had been descending ahead of them. Nima Sharing descended several hours later, alone. He reported that Kevin had remained beside Laura at 28,400 feet, refusing to move. When Nima last saw them, Kevin was sitting in the snow with Laura's head cradled against his shoulder, both figures motionless except for the spindrift accumulating on their suits. By the time conditions allowed a check from above, Kevin was no longer responsive. Both Kevin and Laura Torrance were confirmed dead on May 21st. Laura from cerebral edema and exposure where she collapsed. Kevin found less than 3 feet from her, dead from exposure and exhaustion, having never attempted to descend. The bodies were documented and left where they were found. Ethan was evacuated to Kathmandu, where surgeons amputated 3 fingers on his left hand and set the compound fracture in his forearm with surgical pins. He flew home to Boulder alone. Jiang Bu Sonam's right knee revealed a fully torn anterior cruciate ligament and cartilage damage that surgery could stabilize, but not restore. Chronic instability on steep terrain ended his high-altitude career after 9 summits and 12 seasons, finished by a descent he shouldn't have had to make, protecting a client who shouldn't have been there. Laura's final social media post from Camp 4, showing the family in matching down suits with the southeast ridge behind them, captioned as everything they had worked toward, received over 60,000 likes in the weeks that followed. Now, let me take you to March 4th, 2016, at a cenote dive site near Tulum, Quintana Roo, Mexico. The Yucatan Peninsula sits above one of the most extensive submerged cave networks on Earth. Hundreds of miles of flooded limestone passages connected by sinkholes that open at the surface as pools of completely still, clear water. I remember the first time I saw photos of a cenote and assuming the color had been edited. It's not, and honestly that makes it worse. The person we're looking at here is Nolan Reyes, 31, from Tampa, Florida. Not an inexperienced diver. PADI open water, certified roughly 40 to 50 logged ocean dives over 4 years. Comfortable underwater, familiar with the equipment. genuinely capable in the environments he'd been trained for. He was visiting Tulum on personal vacation and had arranged the cenote dive independently after coming across underwater photography from the site on travel platforms. No group, no guide, just him and a rental kit, and what I think was a reasonable but ultimately fatal assumption that diving is diving. And here's the thing, I really want to land before getting into the sequence. Open water certification and cave diving certification are not the same thing at all, and I didn't fully understand how different they were until I spent time in the research for this. Open water teaches you to dive in environments where the surface is always above you. Up is always an exit. Cave diving is an entirely separate discipline built around environments where there is no surface within reach, no natural light, and no margin for error with your gas. The skills don't transfer. The mindset doesn't transfer. The equipment isn't even the same. The site ran as a semi-managed tourist location, gear rental available, a local operator offering guided group tours through the open chamber and cavern zone. Nolan rented equipment, declined the guided tour, showed his open water certification card, and said he preferred to go independently. The operator let him. No cave certification check, no cavern qualification verified, nothing. One question, do you have cave certification, would have ended this here. That question wasn't asked. He entered the water at approximately 9:45 a.m. A dive guide running a separate group noticed Nolan swimming toward the cavern zone boundary about 15 minutes after entry, marked by a permanent line and a warning placard, but was mid-descent with his own group and couldn't intervene. I've thought about what that guide could have done differently, and I keep landing on nothing. Nolan's integrated dive computer placed him past the cavern zone boundary at 10:02 a.m. Inside cave passages, navigation runs almost entirely on permanently installed guidelines. Ropes anchored through the system by specialist cave divers that serve as the only reliable path back to the surface. Nolan wasn't carrying a personal line or cave reel. Standard open water gear doesn't include one, and I genuinely never heard of that piece of equipment before I started pulling this story apart. At 10:09 a.m., his integrated dive computer logged a depth fluctuation and a sharp increase in air consumption. What that data indicates, practically, is a diver who has lost the guideline and is searching for it with increasing urgency. Here's where it compounds fast. Movement from an untrained diver disturbs the silt on the cave floor, and once that silt lifts, visibility goes from over 80 feet to near zero in seconds. Cave divers call it a silt out. Someone described it to me once as having the lights cut in a room you've never been in, with the furniture rearranged and no door handle you can feel for. Every passage looks identical. No direction makes more sense than another, and your air supply is running the whole time you're trying to figure it out. Nolan's air consumption rate spiked sharply after 10:09 a.m. His integrated dive computer's pressure logs recorded all of it. By the time he was found, his tank was empty. His last recorded depth was 31 feet. At 10:23 a.m. Nothing after that. The operator raised the alarm around 40 minutes past his expected surface time. A specialist cave rescue team. And I want to emphasize that, because it's not like sending in a regular dive crew. This is a specific trained, narrow discipline. Entered the system at approximately 12:30 p.m. and located Nolan about 180 feet from the cavern zone boundary. He was found without his regulator in place, which is consistent with documented behavior in divers who lose consciousness from air exhaustion in a confined space. His integrated dive computer was recovered intact and provided a complete record. Every depth change, every pressure drop, the full consumption spike, right up to the last timestamp. The permanent guideline was found exactly where it was supposed to be. Nolan was 30 feet from it, 30 feet from the line, on an empty tank in the dark. I'm not sure what to do with that, except put it down exactly as it is. It was September 3rd, 2017. The limestone cliffs at Karang Boma on Bali's southern coast had drawn tourists for years. Sightseers standing behind railings, photographing the Indian Ocean breaking against the rock shelves below. That afternoon, 2 Australians were on the wrong side of that railing, and several strangers were already filming them on their phones before anything went wrong. Rylan Sayer, 26, was an electrician from Perth who had spent 2 years saving for an extended backpacking trip through Southeast Asia. He was methodical at work. Colleagues said he rechecked his own measurements twice. But months of travel had developed in him a habit of treating barriers as suggestions. He had no formal climbing training, but was physically fit, and had scrambled up rocky terrain at several earlier stops on the trip without incident. Talia said that he had briefly climbed at an indoor gym the year before and had oddly kept his worn climbing shoes in a small chalk bag clipped to a belt loop on his pack for the trip. Talia Verne, 24, was a hospitality worker from Fremantle who had joined Ryland several months in. Friends described her as the more grounded of the two, but by early September, the pair had routinely ducked under viewpoint barriers at cliff sites across the region to reach lower rock for better angles. Neither owned a harness, a helmet, or any protective gear of any kind. Karang Boma drops roughly 300 feet from the upper viewpoint to the ocean. The lower wall levels into sloping shelves above the waterline, jagged, sea-worn platforms that offer no soft landing. By 4:20 p.m., the pair had descended a narrow trail below the viewpoint and begun free climbing the lower wall. Tourists at the railing above noticed them almost immediately. Multiple visitors began recording on phones as Ryland and Talia climbed roughly 40 feet to a narrow ledge. At that height, the rock below sloped sharply toward the jagged shelves near the shoreline. Onlookers had a clear, unobstructed view of everything that followed. Limestone in coastal environments develops a deceptive outer crust, porous, weakened by years of salt spray, and prone to fracturing under concentrated pressure without any warning whatsoever. On the ledge, the two began arguing about direction. Witnesses later told police that Ryland wanted to traverse left toward a sloping ramp, while Talia insisted the route continued straight up. Both remained clinging to the wall as the exchange grew audible to the tourists above. The argument escalated. Then Talia reached behind her waist, grabbed a handful of loose powder from the open chalk bag, and threw it directly at Ryland's face. The chalk struck him squarely. The white cloud of powder is clearly visible in the recovered footage. His head snapped back. His right hand came off the wall instinctively and moved toward his eyes. His body pivoted outward from the rock. His right foot lost its edge. One of the footage showed the rubber sole of his climbing shoe scrape hard across the limestone. A sharp, dragging movement as he scrambled to recover contact. For a moment, he hung from a single handhold, no wider than a fingertip edge. Then that grip failed. He fell backward, away from the wall. He dropped the full 40 feet, and his body struck the sloping rock shelf below with a heavy, flat impact audible to those watching from above. He rolled and tumbled down the incline toward the lower ledges near the waterline. Multiple tourists at the railing screamed. Talia remained on the wall, clinging to the rock. People at the railing shouted toward the trail below. Multiple tourists contacted emergency services. Indonesian coastal rescue personnel reached the base of the cliff roughly 35 minutes later after descending the steep access trail and carrying equipment down the narrow approach path. Ryland was pronounced dead at the scene. Talia was helped down from the ledge by rescue personnel and was physically uninjured. Coroner's summary: Ryland Sayer, male, 26. Cause of death: blunt force injuries consistent with a fall from height onto hard rock. Documented injuries included a skull fracture, cervical spine disruption, multiple rib fractures, and severe internal bleeding across the chest and abdomen. Death was attributed to catastrophic trauma sustained on impact. No pre-existing medical conditions contributed to the fall. Police collected footage from multiple witnesses and conducted interviews over the following days. Investigators ultimately determined the chalk throw was not intended to cause a fall, and no criminal charges were filed. The incident received brief regional coverage, framed primarily as a warning against unequipped climbing at coastal cliff sites. No changes were made to the trail or the viewpoint barriers. Ryland Sayer had been traveling for 4 months when he died. Now, let me take you to January 9th, 2017, Devil's Pool on the Zambian edge of Victoria Falls. It's a natural rock basin at the literal lip of Victoria Falls, held in place by a submerged rock ledge, with a 354-foot drop into the Zambezi Gorge directly below. People swim in it. That's the attraction. You swim in a pool at the edge of one of the largest waterfalls on Earth. You take photos, It looks absolutely insane. And under the right conditions, it is genuinely manageable. However, the conditions on January 9th were not those conditions. Travis Wren, 34, from Minneapolis, was on a 5-day trip through Zambia with 2 colleagues. A trip loosely planned for about a year that finally came together over the holidays. Software consultant, organized, physically active, a recreational lap swimmer, comfortable in still water. The 3 of them had added Devil's Pool to the itinerary the afternoon before after coming across photos on a travel forum. The operator had availability due to a cancellation. The booking went through that evening, and they showed up the next morning with no particular reason to think the excursion was anything other than what it advertised itself to be. I've seen those photos while researching this. I understand the booking decision completely, and that's not me being dismissive of what happened. It's me being honest about how little those photos tell you about timing. Here's what most people don't know about Devil's Pool, and what I didn't know before I started digging into this. It only works because of a very specific set of water conditions. The Zambezi has a low water season running roughly August through December. And during that window, the inner rock ledge creates a protected pocket where the current is manageable enough to swim in safely. Once the rainy season kicks in around December, water levels start climbing, and that ledge becomes progressively less effective. By January, the current at the outer edge is a fundamentally different thing than what the attraction is actually built around. Some operators close the excursion at that point, others don't. And enforcement of the seasonal closure in 2017 was inconsistent enough that Travis's group was out there on January 9th. 5 guests total, 1 guide, with nothing between them and that outer edge except information that was never passed on. What the investigation turned up about that morning is the part I keep coming back to. The guide was a seasonal hire, 6 weeks on the job. Both of Travis's colleagues gave consistent statements afterward. There was no briefing before they entered the water. Nothing about the outer edge, nothing about January flow conditions, nothing about what the inner ledge was actually doing, or why it mattered. The group entered the water without any of that information. I want to be specific about that, because it changes something fundamental about how this reads. Travis didn't override a warning. He never received one. And here's the thing about that outer edge. His swimming ability had absolutely nothing to do with what was about to happen. He swam laps regularly, comfortable, capable, physically fit in the water. None of that applies when you're talking about a current running horizontally over the lip of a 354-foot waterfall. You cannot swim against that. The water is moving one way and then over, and if you're in contact with it at the outer edge during January flow, you're going with it. That's just what happens. Travis drifted toward the outer edge while photographing the drop with a waterproof camera. The guide noticed and moved toward him, but with no boundary instruction having been established before entry, he'd been managing the full group reactively from the moment they got in. The current caught Travis's lower body before the guide could close the distance. He reached for the rock surface at the outer lip, which at elevated January water levels had been submerged for weeks. Coated in algae, no friction, nothing to hold. The current pulled him over the edge in approximately 4 to 5 seconds from first contact. Both colleagues and the guide witnessed it from inside the pool. There was nothing anyone could do from that position once it started. River rescue teams launched a downstream search from the base of the falls. Travis's body was recovered approximately 1.3 miles downstream, roughly 49 hours after the incident. Cause of death was blunt force trauma, and drowning consistent with a fall of that height into high-velocity water. Both mechanisms together, not separately. That's one of those details I wish I hadn't had to read as many times as I did putting this together. The operator was suspended pending review. Flow gauge data from the Zambezi River Authority confirmed water levels well into mid-rainy season range that morning. That data was publicly available. The seasonal limitation was documented and known, and 5 guests entered that pool without a single word of it mentioned to them. Ruled accidental. What the investigation established clearly is that the information needed to prevent this existed, was measurable, had a public record attached to it, and was not used. That's not an absence of knowledge, that's an absence of enforcement. And I think those two things get treated as the same thing far more often than they should. It was July 21st, 2016. Cathedral Peak's granite slabs were still damp from overnight temperatures that had dropped into the low 40s. and a thin haze clung to the high country around Tuolumne Meadows. Experienced climbers would have predicted the fall about to happen, but not 19-year-old Tevin Relko. Tevin was a first-year automotive technology student at a community college in Modesto, California, who worked weekends at a local tire shop. People said that he had done indoor climbing at a gym several times and one outdoor top rope session the previous spring. That summer, friends said he'd watched enough climbing footage online to make Yosemite granite look approachable, and a weekend camping trip became the plan. He drove up with two friends, camped Friday night, and by Saturday morning was walking out toward Cathedral Peak's lower slabs. That morning, the group watched experienced climbers roping up on a crack route nearby. Tevin was physically solid, stocky, athletic enough from years of recreational soccer, and watching the climbers move across the lower granite made the rock look manageable. He pointed at a low-angle slab rising roughly 70 to 80 feet above the apron below, and told his friend Marco he was going to try a short section. Marco stood on the apron and started recording on his phone. Tevin was wearing worn athletic sneakers rather than climbing shoes. Two hikers descending a nearby trail stopped about 60 yards away to watch. Cathedral Peak sits at roughly 10,900 feet in the Tuolumne Meadows area, where glacially polished granite offers almost no natural holds on its open faces. Climbing these slabs depends entirely on friction smearing, pressing the full sole of a climbing shoe flat against rock to generate grip through surface contact alone. The slab Tevin had chosen remained partially shaded, the surface still holding moisture from the overnight cold, leaving sections of the granite slick where the shade had prevented the rock from drying. Tevin moved up slowly, keeping his body low, reaching 20 feet, then 30. The phone video shows him pausing twice to adjust his footing, before stepping his right foot onto a section of granite where a faint damp sheen remained. His shoe moved immediately. His left foot came across to compensate, but skidded sideways. His upper body tilted backward. For 2 or 3 seconds, he remained standing, arms dropping as he tried to recover balance. But the slope was working against him. Both feet went out at once and his body came down flat onto the granite, back and hips striking simultaneously with a sound witnesses described as a hard slap against stone. He began to slide immediately. The video shows him accelerating face up, arms swinging wide, trying to find purchase on smooth rock. His shirt rode up, and bare skin contacted the surface, but at that speed, friction against skin meant nothing. Marco's phone footage captured him covering nearly 20 feet in under 3 seconds. At the lower edge of the slab, the angle transitioned sharply to a short rock step that dropped several feet onto a steeper apron below. He went over it without slowing. He struck rock, tumbled, and began cartwheeling down the lower apron. The two hikers later reported seeing him tumble and bounce across the granite from their position for nearly 80 feet, his head and torso striking the surface multiple times before he came to rest near scattered boulders at the base. One of the hikers called 91. Marco and the hikers approached but did not move him because of the obvious severity of the injuries and the risk of spinal trauma. Search and rescue personnel, including a park helicopter crew already on duty in the Tuolumne area, arrived approximately 22 minutes later. Tevin was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner's report identified massive closed head trauma with intracranial bleeding as the primary cause of death, accompanied by multiple rib fractures, a fractured pelvis, and internal bleeding consistent with repeated high-impact contact with a hard surface during an uncontrolled fall across open granite. Marco turned the phone recording over to park authorities as part of the investigation. Tevin's family arrived from Modesto the following day. The incident drew brief coverage in a regional outdoor publication, primarily framed as a warning about unroped climbing on damp, high-country granite. The publication summarized the footage but did not release the video itself. Park rangers noted the location alongside several others where similar incidents had occurred. It was July 22, 2019, at K2 Base Camp, Pakistan, 16,900 feet. Before dawn, the temperature hovered around minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, under clear skies with steady 15-knot southwest winds. Visibility stretched clean across the Godwin-Austen Glacier toward the Abruzzi Spur. No snowfall, no visible storm front, no immediate instability. On the surface, conditions were within the normal margin for launching a summit rotation. For Liam Hendriks, this was the window he had built his life around. At 23, the Denver software developer had completed 47 technical climbs across 4 continents and secured a major sponsorship tied to a K2 summit. An international gear company had invested heavily in the attempt, with bonuses contingent on documented success before July 31st. The pressure was financial, but also personal. He had already stood on Denali and Aconcagua, yet an Everest bid the year before ended at Camp 3 due to altitude sickness. K2 represented both redemption and validation. He prepared for 18 months, high-altitude runs above 8,000 feet, endurance sessions stretching to 25 miles, technical ice climbs on WI-4 and WI-5 routes, and heavy pack carries progressing from 40 to 80 pounds. He trained in a hypoxic tent simulating 14,000 feet and recorded strong cardiovascular metrics, including a low resting heart rate and high VO2 max. His equipment matched expedition standards: a minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit rated sleeping system and boots, a full 8,000-meter suit, and a regulated oxygen setup selected for reliability in the Karakoram. His younger brother, Elias Hendriks, 21, joined primarily to support the summit bid. He had solid rock and ice experience across Colorado and neighboring states, including multiple WI-3 to WI-5 climbs, but none above 12,000 feet. He followed a modified endurance program, 35 to 40 miles of running weekly and pack carries increasing from 30 to 60 pounds. Medical screening showed normal cardiac and pulmonary function. Still, above 20,000 feet, conditioning alone does not ensure adaptation. K2 would be his first true exposure to extreme altitude. Their guides, Pasang Sherpa, 41, and Dorje Sherpa, 38, brought decades of high-altitude experience, including multiple K2 expeditions and severe storm survival. Pasang was known for conservative turnaround decisions when pressure trends shifted, while Dorje specialized in route preparation and high-altitude rescue. Both were trained to read Karakoram-specific wind, pressure, and cloud patterns, skills critical when forecasts begin to diverge from real-time conditions. They held advanced certifications and final authority on safety decisions, monitoring pressure shifts, wind loading, snow accumulation, and fixed line integrity as the margin above Camp 4 narrowed. The team climbed via the Abruzzi Spur, staging upward through a series of camps to Camp 4 at roughly 25,300 feet below the summit pyramid. The route begins with the house chimney at 18,000 feet. A vertical rock section climbed in crampons, then narrows into exposed ridge lines above 20,000 feet, with thousands of feet of fall potential. Between 22,800 and 24,000 feet, the Black Pyramid forces sustained mixed climbing on steep rock and ice up to 60 degrees. Protection is limited, and fixed anchors are widely spaced, making each ice screw or piton a critical link in the ascent. Above Camp 4, the route steepens toward the bottleneck, a narrow couloir beneath unstable hanging seracs capable of releasing massive ice without warning. The entire section depends on a continuous fixed line system anchored every 150 to 200 feet. In poor visibility, losing that rope often means losing the route. Camps below: Advanced Base Camp at 19,300 feet, Camp 1 at 20,500 feet, Camp 2 at 21,600 feet, and Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, offer progressively less protection as elevation increases. By Camp 4, the mountain is fully exposed. There is no natural wind barrier, and above 26,000 feet, there is no sheltered retreat if a storm accelerates. Helicopter rescue is impossible above roughly 20,000 feet, and severe winds can halt movement along fixed lines entirely. Once a team commits above Camp 4, there is no external backup system if conditions deteriorate faster than expected. By 7:47 p.m. on July 22nd, things things started to shift. The wind changed direction, turning from southwest to northwest. The temperature dropped quickly within minutes. Pasung checked his altimeter and saw the air pressure falling faster than normal. On K2, that combination usually means a storm is moving in. The sky still looked mostly clear, but pressure drops and wind changes often happen before clouds build. Camp 4 sits out in the open, with no natural wind protection. If the storm sped up, there would be nowhere to hide. Above Camp 4, nearly 3,000 vertical feet still stood between them and the summit. Every step depended on fixed ropes for both movement and safety. The tents, rated to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, were anchored into ice, but they were staging points, not real shelter from a major storm. At that height, the air holds only about 1/3 the oxygen found at sea level. Supplemental oxygen can help for a few hours, but it doesn't guarantee a safe return. Once they climbed above Camp 4, getting back down would take time, and bad weather would slow them even more. At 10:30 p.m., Pasang stepped outside the tent and tried to reach base camp on the satellite phone to confirm the latest weather update, but the connection kept dropping. The signal would lock for a few seconds, then fade into static. A few minutes later, Dorje pointed toward the northwest. A tall wall of clouds was rising behind the ridgeline, climbing higher than the summit itself. It wasn't scattered cloud cover. It was dense, vertical, and building quickly, the kind of formation that can turn the upper mountain violent in a matter of hours. By 11:45 p.m., Elias mentioned a steady headache at 25,300 feet. He had eaten only about 400 calories that evening, roughly half of what a summit push demands. He brushed it off and said he could keep going. Outside, the wind had deepened into a constant roar, and stronger gusts pressed the tent walls inward. At 1 a.m., the cloud wall had moved much closer. Sustained winds pushed past 45 knots, and temperatures dropped toward minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Dorje briefly reached base camp by radio and caught part of a warning recommending descent before the signal cut out. Even without the full message, the Sherpas understood what they were seeing. The pressure was falling fast, and the cloud structure matched storms they had seen trap climbers above 26,000 feet for days. The Sherpas advised immediate descent to Camp 3 before the storm locked in. Liam disagreed. He pointed to visible gaps in the cloud cover towards sections of the route. He noted that his altimeter had stabilized over the past hour. He had oxygen calculated for the push. He reminded them of the limited summit window and the approaching deadline tied to his sponsorship. Waiting meant losing the attempt, and the financial bonus that depended on it. The guides repeated their warning. If the storm intensified above 26,000 feet, retreat would slow, then stall. Wind could bury the ropes. Visibility could collapse. Once that happened, there would be no safe way down. The disagreement grew sharper. Liam insisted the conditions were still climbable. He believed they could move fast enough to stay ahead of the system. Elias, despite the headache and reduced food intake, backed his brother. At approximately 1:45 a.m., the discussion ended. The Sherpas would not go higher. The brothers would. But they chose to go up without the Sherpas. Liam said they could move faster as a two-man team, less waiting. He believed they had about 12 hours before the storm fully arrived. If they climbed quickly, they could reach the summit and get back down before it closed in. He focused on what he could still see: patches of clear sky, sections of the route that didn't look fully buried. He believed speed would solve the problem. Pasung and Dorje stayed inside the tent. They had already made their decision. From their point of view, the risk had crossed the line. The pressure drop, the wind shift, the building cloud mass, those signs mattered more than what the sky looked like in that moment. They did not shout. They did not block the brothers physically. They repeated their warning. Once the storm hit above 26,000 feet, it would not matter how strong or fast anyone was. At 2 a.m., Liam and Elias started packing. They stripped their gear down to roughly 18-pound packs, lighter than the usual summit load. Extra food stayed behind. Spare layers stayed behind. Some emergency equipment stayed behind. No group shelter. No extra supplies beyond what they believed they would need for a fast push. They were betting on clean movement and no delays. Elias moved more slowly than earlier in the evening. The headache was still there. He tightened his harness and checked his ascender. Liam double-checked his oxygen flow rate. They clipped radios to their suits. The wind outside was louder now, snapping against the tent fabric in the uneven bursts. By 2:15 a.m., the cloud wall had moved closer, about 8 miles out. Winds were holding near 50 knots, and snow was beginning to blow across the surface in low waves. Visibility dropped to about a mile, then less in gusts. The storm was moving faster than expected. At that speed, it could reach the upper mountain within a couple of hours. Blowing snow thickened. The surface lost contrast. The fixed rope would soon become the only reliable reference. Once the wind increased further, even that line would be hard to see. They stepped out of the tent and clipped into the rope. At 2:30 a.m., Liam and Elias stepped out of Camp 4 and clipped their ascenders onto the fixed rope. The wind was already pushing hard against their backs. Their headlamps lit only a narrow tunnel in front of them. Beyond that small circle of light, everything was black and moving. The slope above camp steepened quickly. They climbed using front points on their crampons, kicking into hard, wind-packed snow. Each move followed the same pattern: kick, stand, slide the ascender up the rope, breathe. At that altitude, breathing felt thin and shallow. Even with oxygen, every step required focus. Early on, they were moving well, close to 800 vertical feet per hour, which was strong for that height. They checked in with Pasang by radio every 15 minutes. But the wind began breaking up the signal. Words came through in pieces, buried under static. By the time they reached around 25,800 feet, the wind had strengthened and snow was blowing sideways across the slope. Elias was breathing harder. He told Liam he needed a short stop. Liam climbed about 200 feet higher before pausing to wait. In calm weather, that distance would be manageable. In rising wind and drifting snow, it meant their headlamps were barely visible to each other. When they resumed climbing, the wind no longer came in steady pushes. It hit in violent bursts. Gusts slammed into their sides, forcing them to lean into the slope just to stay upright. Snow moved horizontally across the mountain, cutting visibility and filling every crease in their gear. At one point, Elias drove his front points into what looked like firm snow, but the layer was thin. Beneath it was hard blue ice. His crampons failed to bite. His feet shot out from under him. The rope caught his weight with a sharp jolt, and he swung outward before crashing back against the slope. Later, examination of the fixed line showed deep abrasion marks and unusual tension wear in that section, evidence of a sudden fall being arrested under heavy load. He pulled himself back in. He cleared snow from his ascender with shaking hands and reattached it to the line, but ice was already building inside the teeth of the device. Carabiner gates were stiff. Every upward slide along the rope required more force than before. Investigators later documented ice clogging in similar hardware recovered from the site, confirming how quickly equipment would have begun to jam in those conditions. Visibility continued shrinking. Their headlamps reflected off blowing snow and created a white wall inches from their faces. The rope, normally visible as a dark line against the slope, vanished into drift. Anchors disappeared beneath fresh accumulation. They were no longer climbing by sight. They were climbing by touch, feeling for the rope with gloved hands. Shortly after they passed 26,000 feet, the storm intensified sharply. Weather data from lower camps and damage to structures at Camp 4 later indicated winds on the upper slope likely exceeded 70 to 80 knots. The horizon disappeared completely. There was no difference between sky and ground. In the official review, investigators noted that once full whiteout set in, even a step or two off the rope would leave a climber with no visual reference to recover it. That is likely what happened to Elias. He lost sight of the rope. In whiteout, it can disappear even when it is only a few feet away. He reached out, sweeping his hand across empty air and wind-packed snow. Nothing. He shuffled sideways, boots scraping across the surface, searching for tension in the line. After the storm, searchers found faint crampon scratches angling slightly away from the main ascent track in that area. Small deviations that suggested he had drifted off route while trying to relocate the rope. The snow crust there was uneven and brittle, covering patches of hard ice. In winds strong enough to shove a climber sideways, balance depends on precise foot placement. One placement failed. His front points punched through the thin snow layer and skidded across ice. Without the rope clipped and weighted, there was nothing to catch the shift. On a slope steeper than 45 degrees, gravity takes over instantly. Elias slipped. He slid down the angled face, crampons scraping without purchase. The disturbed snow pattern later observed above his location was consistent with a short but uncontrolled slide. He struck uneven terrain below. Evidence at the site suggested immediate injury. In winds approaching hurricane force, even a survivable fall becomes critical within minutes. Separated from the rope, disoriented in whiteout, with wind chill likely near minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, he had no fixed reference point to climb back toward. There were no signs of a successful attempt to regain the line. The cold would have begun draining body heat immediately. According to the forensic report, exposure at that intensity could lower core temperature to fatal levels within several hours, especially after trauma. Higher on the slope, Liam kept moving. Whether he realized Elias had fallen cannot be confirmed. In those winds, shouting is useless. Sound does not travel. Light does not carry. If he looked back, he would have seen nothing but blowing white. Investigators later found signs that Liam paused briefly in that section. Rope loading patterns suggested a stop where tension remained steady for several minutes. It is possible he called out. It is possible he waited for a response. There was no answer. Instead of descending, he continued upward. His oxygen was still flowing at that point. The regulator setting found later on, his cylinder, indicated a moderate flow rate, consistent with summit effort. Based on remaining capacity and the time he left Camp 4, experts estimated his oxygen would have run empty during the height of the storm. There were also indications he may have stopped again higher up. Investigators noted a short section of rope where snow had been cleared away in a circular pattern, suggesting he stood in place for several minutes. Some speculated he may have attempted to film or document conditions. His sponsorship required summit documentation, but no camera was recovered, and extreme wind could easily have torn loose any handheld device. What is certain is that he remained exposed in worsening conditions longer than safety allowed. Once his oxygen cylinder ran dry, above 26,000 feet, everything would have slowed. Without supplemental oxygen, thinking becomes unclear. Simple decisions take longer. Fine motor skills weaken. Clearing ice from an ascender becomes difficult. Clipping into anchors becomes clumsy. Weather data later confirmed gusts likely exceeded 80 knots in that window. In winds that strong, even standing upright requires full concentration. Each step becomes a fight against both gravity and air. Liam's path was reconstructed from partial boot impressions and tension patterns in the fixed line after the storm. Those marks showed he climbed several hundred feet higher after Elias fell. He was later found at 26,900 feet, roughly 400 feet above his brother's last position. His oxygen cylinder was empty. His radio was never recovered. There were no signs he had begun a controlled descent. He had kept climbing into a storm that had already closed the mountain around them. By 8:30 a.m., Camp 4 recorded minus 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind pushed tent walls inward despite reinforced anchors. Guy lines vibrated under heavy strain. Ice screws flexed in repeated gusts. Snow buried tracks and covered sections of fixed rope near camp. Even the Sherpas had to stay clipped in just to step outside the tent without losing their sense of direction. Above them, at the worst point of the storm, there was no shelter and no safe way down. When the rope vanished in the whiteout and the wind reached full force, the upper mountain became sealed off. Liam and Elias were trapped in it. No guides beside them, no clear view, and no safe path back. Inside Camp 4, Pasang and Dorje kept sending out emergency beacon signals on the distress frequency. They tried stepping out in short, careful moves, always clipped in, but the wind pushed them back. A few steps away from the tent, direction became unclear. In those conditions, even rescuers can get lost and die. The beacons kept transmitting, but no aircraft could reach that height. Base camp confirmed what everyone already knew. Helicopter rescue was impossible. Helicopters cannot fly above about 20,000 feet, even in good weather. That day, winds were too strong across the entire mountain, and visibility was too poor. There would be no help from the air. Any rescue would have to come from climbers on foot, facing the same wind and cold. By early evening, the wind dropped slightly to around 60 knots, and visibility improved to roughly 100 feet. It was still violent, still dangerous, but for the first time, limited movement outside the tent became possible, if done slowly, clipped in, and step by step. Pasang initiated a tethered search pattern within a controlled radius, using safety lines anchored every 25 feet to prevent searchers' disorientation and separation from camp. Dorje located a single track line heading upward, ending at an anchor point roughly 200 feet above camp. The rope showed fresh loading abrasion, consistent with heavy tension during ascent, confirming climber passage during early climbing phases. Beyond that anchor, the storm had erased all trace. Snow accumulation and wind transport eliminated surface evidence of route finding, equipment placement, or continued movement patterns. Light faded quickly at altitude, forcing a return to camp before searchers could extend their range significantly. At 6 a.m. on July 24th, the wind eased to about 35 knots, and visibility improved to roughly 400 to 500 feet. The temperature was still near minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, but the worst of the storm had passed. The conditions were far from safe, yet they were stable enough to allow a search. Pasang and Dorje used the break in the weather to begin climbing upward along the fixed line. Even with reduced winds, each step required caution. Sections of rope were still buried under drifted snow, and anchors had to be cleared by hand before they could move higher. They called out for Liam and Elias as they climbed, pausing often to listen, but there was no response. They continued upward to nearly 26,800 feet, the highest point they could safely reach under the remaining conditions. About About 1,500 feet above Camp 4 at 7:30 a.m., they located Elias at approximately 26,400 feet, roughly 150 feet east of the main fixed line. The slope above him showed signs of a fall during whiteout conditions. His harness and equipment were intact, and his radio was still attached, though the battery had failed in the extreme cold. There were no signs that he had been able to set up shelter or attempt a prolonged fight against the storm. In clear weather, that distance from the route would have been easy to correct. In zero visibility, it became fatal. Approximately 45 minutes later, Liam was located at 26,900 feet, roughly 400 feet higher. His oxygen cylinder was empty, and no radio was recovered. Positioning suggested that he continued climbing after the separation until physical incapacitation. Forensic review concluded Elias died from traumatic injury combined with exposure, while Liam succumbed to hypothermia compounded by hypoxia after oxygen depletion. Core temperatures likely reached fatal levels within several hours under peak storm conditions. Recovery required hours of controlled descent in severe weather. Post-incident data confirmed the storm intensified, with upper mountain winds exceeding 120 knots and summit temperatures near -58 degrees Fahrenheit. In such conditions, fixed lines become inaccessible, equipment fails, and rescue is impossible above 26,000 feet. The critical point occurred earlier, when pressure trends shifted and descent was advised. Once the storm sealed the upper mountain, survival margins disappeared, and recovery became possible only after conditions eased. The official investigation found that both climbers died from severe cold exposure and altitude sickness, made worse by the extreme storm conditions. Weather records later showed the storm was much stronger than predicted, with wind speeds and temperatures about 40% harsher than the highest values in the forecast for that area. A later review found several factors that contributed to the outcome. Weather monitoring at extreme altitude was limited, and short-term forecasts were treated as more reliable than they proved to be. Experienced guides had recognized early warning signs in wind and pressure changes, but those concerns were weighed against improving forecasts and the pressure of a time-sensitive summit goal. Financial incentives and narrowing opportunity likely influenced the decision to continue despite shifting conditions. Choosing to climb without guide support removed an important safety layer built on long-term pattern recognition and local experience. At the same time, the storm intensified faster than expected, and once the climbers were above 26,000 feet, options for safe retreat were extremely limited. After the incident, Summit Gear International revised its sponsorship contracts to remove deadline-based bonuses and require agreement from guides before summit attempts. The Pakistan Alpine Club introduced mandatory weather review periods before climbs above 8,000 meters. Pasung and Dorje later helped establish a weather monitoring station at K2 Base Camp to provide more reliable real-time data for future expeditions. Liam Hendricks, 23, and Elias Hendricks, 21, died because a storm system moved faster than human prediction, and they climbed beyond the reach of rescue. It was October 14th, 2015, on the cliffs of Moher, County Clare, Ireland. The cliffs rise to approximately 700 feet at their highest point near O'Brien's Tower, and that afternoon, the air sat around 48 degrees Fahrenheit with sustained gusts between 55 and 72 miles per hour coming off the Atlantic. I've stood there before, and the wind isn't something you passively experience. It pushes against you with enough weight that you find yourself adjusting your footing without thinking about it. Ailsa Dunbar, 31, was 3 weeks into a solo trip across the British Isles and Ireland, funded over 2 years of deliberate saving. She was from Glasgow, had no technical climbing or outdoors experience, and had been carefully documenting the trip online from the start. That kind of trip takes real commitment, and I think that changes something about how you show up when you finally get there. The cliffs of Moher had been on her list for years before she booked the flight. She had already uploaded 3 photos from the official viewing platform earlier that afternoon. The kind of photos that make a place look exactly as dramatic as it promises to be and exactly as safe as it looks. I've looked at photos taken from that platform, and I understand exactly why someone sees safety in them. That's what makes it difficult to look at. At the time, the primary barrier at the cliffs of Moher consisted of a low stone wall at the official viewing platform. Beyond that, sections of the cliff had minimal to no physical enforcement, particularly in the late afternoon when visitor management staff had reduced. Ailsa was observed by at least 2 other tourists crossing the barrier wall to access the unguarded edge. She wasn't doing something that looked alarming to the people around her, and I think that's the detail that matters most here. She was doing something that apparently looked like what people did there. When risk looks like just what people do there, it stops reading as risk at all. A coastal wind advisory had been issued for County Clare that morning. Other visitors had retreated from the platform edge during the same time window because of the wind strength. The grass along the cliff approach was wet and matted flat from rainfall earlier in the day. I want to be specific about that. Wet, compacted grass on a limestone and shale surface gives you nothing to push against when lateral force hits. No grip, no friction, nothing to catch. The conditions weren't subtle. They were just easy to ignore if you'd already made up your mind. Her phone, recovered after the incident, showed a time-stamped sequence of photos taken across a 22-minute window, each one progressively closer to the edge. I found myself doing the math on that. 22 minutes of moving closer, and I couldn't find a single point where anything gave her a clear reason to stop. Ailsa had positioned herself at the very edge of the cliff, facing outward toward the ocean, phone raised. A sustained gust, estimated at 65 to 70 miles per hour based on that afternoon's coastal wind records, struck from the northwest. The saturated grass beneath her provided no grip, no barrier within reach, no anchor, no handhold anywhere in her immediate position. She was displaced laterally and over the edge in under a second from the moment the gust made contact. The drop at that section measures approximately 700 feet to the rock base and the Atlantic shoreline below. Two visitors roughly 70 to 80 feet away witnessed it directly. And when I read their statements, I noticed neither reported hearing anything from Ailsa above the wind. I went back through that sequence more than once, looking for the moment she could have caught herself. There just isn't one. I went back so many times. Cliff and coastal rescue teams deployed within 20 minutes of the emergency call. Ailsa's body was located at the base of the cliff on an exposed rock ledge above the waterline approximately 6 hours later, recovered by a cliff descent team before the rising tide submerged the ledge. CCTV footage from the visitor center captured her crossing the barrier wall approximately 8 minutes before the incident. Her phone was recovered on the grass at the cliff edge, partially overhanging. The last photo in that sequence was time-stamped 44 seconds before the emergency call came in. I've thought about that number more than once. 44 seconds between the last frame and the moment someone picked up a phone to report what they'd just seen. Cause of death: blunt force trauma consistent with a fall of approximately 700 feet. Ruled accidental. Wind displacement identified as the direct cause. Unsupported position beyond the barrier in active high wind conditions identified as the contributing factor. Physical reinforcement along the off-platform sections of the cliff path was reviewed following this and other incidents in the same period. That word, reviewed, shows up in these reports more than I'd like, and it never quite lands the way accountability should. It was October 8th, 2014, and Stanage Edge cut across the moorland like a long row of broken dark teeth, indifferent to the small figures moving along its base. The autumn air was cold enough to redden exposed skin, and the gritstone was dry, the one condition that had made what happened next even possible. Callum Drex was 22, a warehouse worker on Sheffield's eastern edge who spent his days hauling stock through long, physical shifts. He was compact and physically capable. 3 months earlier, he had started climbing at an indoor gym near his flat, picking up the basics quickly and developing real grip strength. Fellow climbers in the gym said that he progressed through beginner routes with enough consistency that his confidence had outpaced his experience by a significant margin. He had no outdoor climbing mentor and no regular partner with gritstone knowledge. He had talked about eventually climbing outside, but had not made specific plans with anyone who could have told him what he was walking into. A friend he was messaging said that he came to Stanage that afternoon after watching footage of the crag online and identifying routes that looked achievable. He brought no chalk, no harness, no rope, and no crash pad. He wore approach shoes rather than climbing rubber. His plan was to attempt a short unroped free solo of a moderate line near the base, a line that experienced climbers typically protect with gear. What he did not understand was that gritstone is among the most friction-dependent rock types in the sport. Indoor holds are shaped to grip. Gritstone simply offers texture, and that texture fails the moment skin moisture builds. The base of the escarpment was lightly busy. Experienced climbers worked routes further along the edge. Several walkers had paused to look out across the moors, where pale autumn grass stretched south under a flat gray sky. Callum walked to the foot of a roughly 45-foot vertical face and began climbing without speaking to anyone nearby. Within the first 15 feet, 2 walkers had already taken out their phones. They were filming not because they anticipated danger, but because watching someone climb ropeless and chalkless was unusual enough to hold attention. One walker stood roughly 25 feet from the base and filmed with a phone using optical zoom. At 20 feet, his movement looked controlled. At 30 feet, the footage shows his left hand repositioning on the same hold 3 times in succession. His right foot was placed on an edge barely wider than a finger, and the shoe sole was slipping fractionally against the gritstone with each weight transfer. Several of the watchers had gone quiet. His upward movement had effectively stopped. At around 40 feet, he froze. He stayed pressed flat against the rock for several seconds, not moving up or down. Then he began to down climb. The correct decision, arrived at too late. Reversing moves on gritstone requires the same dry friction as ascending, and his palms were now wet with sweat. The footage shows him reaching back with his right foot, searching for a small foothold below. His foot missed it by several inches. His full body weight transferred instantly onto his hands. Both hands peeled off the surface simultaneously. There was no partial catch, no drag, no slowing. His body came away from the wall and dropped straight down, rotating slightly backward. The impact with the rock-strewn ground below was full force and immediate. The phone recording captured the sound of the impact clearly, while the first second of the image blurred as the filmer reacted and shifted the phone downward. Several witnesses hesitated briefly before approaching, unsure if loose rock or additional fall debris made the area unsafe. A walker called emergency services. Police and ambulance services were notified first, and volunteer mountain rescue teams were paged immediately afterward. Mountain rescue volunteers reached the scene approximately 25 minutes later. Death was declared at the scene. The decedent sustained fatal blunt force trauma to the skull and upper cervical spine, consistent with a free fall of approximately 40 feet onto uneven rocky ground. Primary cause of death was catastrophic traumatic brain injury with associated cervical fracture. No protective equipment was present. Callum was pronounced dead at the scene. His family arrived from Sheffield later that evening. The incident received a brief entry in a regional mountaineering safety notice published the following month, citing the case as a cautionary example of indoor climbers attempting outdoor gritstone without appropriate gear, chalk, or local guidance. Witnesses later provided their phone recordings to police, and the footage was retained as evidence. His name received minimal press coverage. The footage was never publicly released. Stanage Edge remained open, as it has always been, to anyone willing to make the walk out to it. It was May 4th, 2017, and Everest Base Camp sat under a pale afternoon sky at 17,600 feet on the Khumbu Glacier. The temperature hovered around 26 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to keep the moraine frozen solid, but mild enough that climbers moved between camps without shell layers. Wind came in low gusts that barely lifted the prayer flag strung between cairns of stacked rock. The glacier groaned beneath the surface, deep structural sounds that carried through the ice like something shifting in its sleep. Cooking stoves hissed from mess tents. Generators hummed. The sprawl of base camp stretched across uneven terrain in clusters organized by expedition company. Bright nylon domes arranged in neighborhoods separated by ice ridges and meltwater channels. More than 40 teams were staged for summit attempts that would unfold over the next 3 weeks. Now, I've covered a lot of Everest stories on this channel, but this one stuck with me in a way I wasn't expecting. Among the climbers settling into their tents that afternoon were Kevin Langford and his son Ethan. Kevin was 46 years old, from Denver, Colorado, a former construction project manager who had spent 22 years in commercial development before watching his career unravel alongside his marriage. His divorce had finalized 2 years earlier, the kind that redistributes not just assets, but identity. Kevin lost the family house in Highlands Ranch, moved into a rented apartment near downtown Denver, and found himself at 44 with weekday custody of a teenager and no clear sense of who he was outside of work and fatherhood. And honestly, I get it. Divorce changes people in brutal ways. But what Kevin did next is where he lost me. Climbing filled the gap. Within 6 months of the divorce, Kevin summited Kilimanjaro on a guided trip. Elbrus followed 3 months later. Neither required serious technical skill, but both gave Kevin something the divorce had taken. A narrative of accomplishment he could point to and say he had built from nothing. And from what I've read, people close to him later said the change was hard to miss. His social media shifted from sporadic family posts to a curated feed of summit photos, gear reviews, and training updates. He joined climbing forums, attended meetups, and began referring to himself as a mountaineer, a term experienced climbers earned over years of apprenticeship in alpine environments, but that Kevin adopted after 2 guided peaks on well-trodden routes. Everest became the fixation, not gradually, but with the sudden intensity of someone who had found the thing that would prove the divorce had not destroyed him. The mountain everyone recognized, the name that carried weight in any conversation, where altitude and suffering translated into respect. He began planning 18 months before departure, saving aggressively and training with a focus that people around him described as obsessive. He told people the climb would redefine him. What he did not say, but what those close to him understood, was that Everest had become evidence, proof that losing his marriage had not meant losing everything. And look, I've covered a lot of stories on this channel where ego drives the decision-making. But what makes this one different is that Kevin's ego wasn't loud. It was quiet, desperate, and aimed directly at his own kid. That's what makes this one hit different. Kevin did not want to climb alone. He wanted Ethan there, not waiting at base camp, standing beside him on the summit, father and son on top of the world. The image carried significance beyond mountaineering. It was redemption framed as adventure, a shared achievement that would bind them in ways the divorce had threatened to sever. Ethan Langford was 18 years old, freshly graduated from a public high school in Littleton, a suburb south of Denver. He was athletic in the way that suburban Colorado teenagers often were. Varsity lacrosse, weekend sport climbing at an indoor gym, a handful of 14er hikes with his father during summers when the family was still whole. But none of that experience extended above 14,000 feet. He had never used crampons, clipped into a fixed rope, or spent a night at altitude where the air held barely half the oxygen his body needed. Personally, this part really annoys me, but I found out while researching this story that his friends later said Ethan told them he did not want to go. He told at least 2 people he was scared, not of the physical difficulty, but of the altitude, the cold, the stories about climbers who never came home. The pressure was more subtle than coercion. Kevin had lost the house, lost the marriage, lost the daily structure of family life. Everest was the thing he was building his new identity around, and he wanted to share it with his son. For Ethan, saying no felt like another rejection, another person walking away from a man who had already lost too much. So he said yes. Kevin booked 2 spots on a commercial expedition operated by a reputable mid-tier company based in Kathmandu. The total cost exceeded $130,000 for both climbers. Permits, logistics, Sherpa support, oxygen, and the infrastructure that turned Everest from an impossible objective into a purchasable experience. Now, the one detail from this story that I kept coming back to during my research was the single Sherpa assigned to them. The expedition provided a dedicated Sherpa for the Langford pair. Jangbu was 36, from Thom, a small village in the Khumbu Valley that had produced some of Nepal's most accomplished high-altitude climbers. 12 Everest summits over 18 years in the guiding industry. His authority came from competence so consistent it had become invisible. The kind of calm that only accumulated through years of correct decisions in environments where incorrect ones killed people. He could read a client's physical deterioration hours before the client recognized it themselves. Expedition leaders trusted him with difficult clients because he combined patience with a willingness to make hard calls when safety demanded it. According to an article I read, Jangbu noticed something about the Langford dynamic within the first 2 days at base camp. Ethan asked questions about the route, the equipment, what altitude sickness felt like. That revealed how little preparation he had received. Not foolish questions, but the questions of someone dropped into an environment without adequate briefing. Each time, Kevin answered for him, reframing uncertainty as enthusiasm. When Ethan mentioned the cold bothering him, Kevin told the group his son was just adjusting. Other expedition members noticed. Kevin dominated conversations, planned logistics for both of them, and spoke about what they would accomplish together. Ethan listened, nodded, and said little. And honestly, that dynamic alone should already have been a red flag to everyone around them. Acclimatization rotations began in late April. The first took them through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet, a shifting maze of ice blocks and crevasses passes crossed on aluminum ladders lashed over gaps that dropped into blackness. Kevin moved through it with steady determination. Ethan was slower, his steps on the ladders hesitant, placed with the over-deliberation of someone calculating consequences rather than trusting instinct. He developed a mild headache at Camp 1 that resolved after descending, nothing disqualifying. But Jiang Bu noted the pattern. The second rotation reached Camp 2 at 21,000 feet in the western CWM. Ethan's headache returned and persisted through the night. His appetite vanished. He managed half a bowl of soup and left the rest. Kevin, by contrast, seemed to gain energy with altitude. He ate, hydrated, studied weather apps, and talked about the summit window with an intensity the team found increasingly singular. The gap between father and son was becoming difficult to ignore, and by this point, any amount of sympathy and understand I had for Kevin had disappeared. The third rotation climbed the Lhotse phase to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, a wall of blue ice steep enough to punish any lapse in concentration. Ethan vomited twice during the ascent. His pace dropped to roughly half his father's, forcing Kevin to wait at anchor points with visible impatience. Checking his watch, adjusting his pack, looking upward. At Camp 3, Ethan's oxygen saturation measured lower than the expedition doctor preferred. Jiang Bu made his first formal move. He approached the expedition leader privately and expressed concern about Ethan's readiness. The symptoms were accumulating: persistent headache, repeated vomiting, slow adaptation, borderline saturation. Together they suggested a body tolerating altitude rather than adapting to it, and the death zone would not reward tolerance. The leader raised it with Kevin, who dismissed the concern. And personally, what he said next made me start thinking how pathetic of a father he was. According to the expedition leader, he reacted and protested aggressively, saying Ethan was tough and his son would rally. During a rest day at base camp, Ethan sat outside his tent with a 23-year-old climber from New Zealand. The conversation was later recounted, and let me tell you, this conversation was heartbreaking to read. Ethan said he wanted to go home, not because he couldn't handle the difficulty, but because none of it felt like his choice. His father needed this, and quitting would mean taking one more thing away from a man who had already lost everything that mattered. The New Zealand climber told him no summit was worth dying for. Ethan reportedly kept nodding and said nothing else. A lot of you commented on my previous videos about how these younger climbers get pulled into situations they never should have been in. This is exactly what that looks like. Kevin spent rest days in the mess tent studying forecasts, counting down to the projected window, asking guides about upper mountain conditions, with the focused energy of someone approaching a deadline. Other climbers recognized the pattern. Expedition veterans called it destination fixation, a mental state where the summit consumed so much bandwidth that the process of getting there safely became secondary. Guides had seen it before. It preceded some of the worst decisions the mountain had ever witnessed. I've researched and told dozens of these stories at this point, and destination fixation shows up in almost every single one. It's the one pattern that never changes. The summit window opened on May 19th. 3 days of reduced wind and clear skies above 26,000 feet. Kevin and Ethan departed base camp on May 18th, reaching Camp 2 by early afternoon. They continued to Camp 3 the following day, Ethan requiring frequent rests that extended the climb nearly 2 hours beyond the planned pace. The push from Camp 3 to Camp 4 crossed the upper Lhotse face, the Yellow Band, and the Geneva Spur, delivering them to the South Col at 26,000 feet and the official boundary of the death zone. Above this altitude, the body could not sustain itself. Every hour of exposure accumulated damage that rest could not reverse. Kevin and Ethan reached Camp 4 at approximately 2 p.m. on May 20th. The South Col was a desolate plateau scoured by wind, littered with the debris of decades, shredded tent fabric, empty oxygen bottles, and the occasional marker indicating something beneath the snow no one discussed. Ethan was depleted. His movements were mechanical, his expression blank. He ate almost nothing. His hands trembled when he tried to grip a water bottle. Jiang Bu checked his oxygen saturation and found it borderline, low enough for concern, not quite low enough to force an objective medical ruling. The gray area was where the worst decisions on Everest were made. Jiang Bu raised it directly with Kevin. Ethan's numbers were marginal. His body had struggled at every stage. He recommended Ethan remain at Camp 4 while Kevin attempted the summit, or that both descend. Kevin's response was immediate. They had not come this far for Ethan to wait in a tent. The oxygen would carry him. He contacted the expedition leader via radio, and the leader, balancing safety against a client who had paid 6 figures and the fact that Ethan was 18, deferred to Kevin's judgment. At 12:15 a.m. on May 21st, Kevin, Ethan, and Jangbu departed Camp 4 into darkness. Minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, wind gusting to 25 miles per hour. Above them, a line of headlamps climbed the triangular face toward the balcony. Kevin set the pace. Ethan followed, each step requiring marginally more effort than the last. Jangbu stayed close, monitoring his breathing and gait. And from every account I read about that night, what happened next was painful to piece together. Other teams passed them as Ethan's pace deteriorated. He stopped every few minutes, bent forward over his ice axe, breathing audible through the oxygen mask. Each rest lasted longer than the one before. They reached the balcony at 5:40 a.m., a narrow platform at 27,600 feet. Jangbu changed Ethan's oxygen bottle and assessed both climbers. Kevin was fatigued but functional. Ethan was not. His feet dragged rather than lifted. He was confused when asked basic questions, slow to respond, uncertain how long they had been climbing. Ethan looked at his father and told him he wanted to go down. The request was quiet, delivered between labored breaths, but unambiguous. He was done. Jangbu immediately backed the decision. Ethan needed to descend now. The symptoms were consistent with severe altitude sickness, progressing towards cerebral edema, a condition that killed quickly and without warning. Kevin looked up. Above the balcony, the southeast ridge climbed toward the south summit, and beyond it, the summit itself. Clear skies, manageable wind, headlamps visible higher on the ridge. Climbers who had departed earlier, moving toward the top of the world. He could see the path to everything he had spent 2 years building toward. He told Jangbu and Ethan they were too close to turn back now. They continued, "I've covered countless summit fever stories on this channel, but a father hearing his own son beg to turn around and choosing the summit anyway, that's something else entirely." For the next 40 minutes, Ethan climbed on willpower and supplemental oxygen alone. His legs moved with the mechanical imprecision of someone whose brain could no longer coordinate reliably. Jangbu stayed within arm's reach, one hand near Ethan's harness at all times, guiding him past obstacles a healthy climber would navigate without thought. At approximately 28,100 feet, on a section of mixed rock and hard snow above the balcony, Ethan's crampon caught on an exposed rock edge. His weakened legs could not recover the stumble. He pitched forward and fell hard onto his left side, his arm taking the full impact against a rock outcrop. The crack was audible through the wind. Ethan screamed, a sound that cut through the thin air and the hiss of oxygen regulators, and reached climbers on the fixed ropes above and below. His left forearm had fractured, a clean break of the radius, immediately apparent from the unnatural angle of his wrist. The pain overwhelmed even the numbing effects of altitude and cold. He could not grip his ice axe. He could not operate his ascender. He could not climb. Jangbu made the call without hesitation. Descent was immediate, non-negotiable. He radioed Camp 4 to report the injury and began preparing Ethan to go down. He splinted the forearm with an ice axe shaft and nylon webbing, immobilizing it as best he could, with numb fingers at 28,000 feet. Ethan's face was gray beneath his oxygen mask, eyes glassy with pain and altitude. Kevin watched the splinting with an expression that shifted from concern to calculation in the span of minutes. He looked up at the ridge above, then down at his injured son, then up again. Honestly, I've already finished reading this story, but I still can't believe what he did next. The summit was roughly 1,000 vertical feet away. 2 hours, maybe 3 in his condition. He told Jangbu he wanted to reach the summit with Ethan at all costs. He was continuing to the summit. Jangbu told Kevin to descend with them. Going up at this altitude, at this hour, after this much exertion, was how people died on Everest. The summit would exist next year and the year after, but the margin above 28,000 feet did not allow for solo attempts by exhausted climbers with depleted oxygen. Kevin listened to all of it and repeated that he was going up. The argument lasted less than 2 minutes. Every second at that altitude cost all 3 of them. Jangbu faced a decision that no training could make easy, but that experience made clear. Kevin was an adult who had chosen. Ethan was an 18-year-old with a broken arm, failing oxygen, and no ability to descend alone. The math was brutal and simple. Jangbu chose the sun. At approximately 7:20 a.m., Kevin Langford turned upward toward the summit of Everest. Jangbu Lakpa turned Ethan Langford downward toward Camp 4. Father and son moved in opposite directions on the same mountain. I'm not going to lie, this part of the story is hard to cover, knowing what comes next for both of them. The descent was punishing. Ethan could not use his left arm, which meant every downward step on the fixed ropes had to be managed with his right hand alone, while Jangbu controlled the line behind him. Each impact of his feet on hard snow sent vibrations through the splinted forearm. He groaned with every step, but kept moving because Jangbu did not let him stop. Stopping in the death zone, Jiangbu knew from 12 seasons on this mountain was the first step toward death. And keep in mind, while all of this is happening, Kevin was still actively climbing toward the summit. They navigated the steep terrain below the balcony through mid-morning, passing ascending climbers who stared at Ethan's splinted arm and stepped aside on the fixed ropes. Frostbite had begun in the fingers of his left hand, where the fracture and the tight webbing of the splint had compromised circulation. The fingers were white and waxy, past the point of pain, which was itself a warning sign. This part was honestly difficult to research. The pictures I saw online were horrifying. On the upper Lhotse face, navigating a steep traverse across hard blue ice, Jiangbu was bearing Ethan's weight through a difficult section when his right knee buckled under the awkward lateral load. The pop was felt more than heard. A ligament giving way under stress it was never designed to carry. Pain flared immediately, sharp enough to buckle his stride. He grabbed the fixed rope with one hand and steadied Ethan with the other, preventing both of them from sliding down the face. But the damage was done. His knee could bear weight only partially, each step sending bolts of pain up his thigh. He adjusted his gait, favoring the damaged leg, and continued downward, because the alternative was dying on the Lhotse face with someone else's son. Kevin Langford reached the summit of Mount Everest alone at approximately 1:40 p.m. on May 21st, 2017. Dangerously late. Experienced climbers aimed to summit by midday at the latest, leaving the afternoon for descent before weather deteriorated and oxygen dwindled. Kevin stood at 29,032 feet with no one beside him. Photos recovered from his camera showed a man whose face was gaunt beneath his oxygen mask, whose eyes held the unfocused stare of someone operating on the last fumes of physiological reserve. He stayed nearly 20 minutes, far longer than his oxygen supply justified, fumbling with the camera and staring at a panorama his brain could barely process. There was no one to tell him to leave. Now, here's where everything started getting too heavy. Even for me, the descent began at approximately 2 p.m. Kevin had been climbing for nearly 14 hours. His oxygen was critically low, perhaps 90 minutes remaining at a rate already insufficient for the altitude. His muscles had been cannibalized by a body desperate for fuel. His brain, starved of oxygen for hours, was losing the capacity to process spatial information and maintain the directional awareness that separated the route from the void on either side. At or near the south summit, approximately 28,700 feet, Kevin began drifting off route. Instead of following the fixed ropes back toward the balcony, he angled away toward terrain with no lines, no markers, and no mercy. The phenomenon was documented in high-altitude medicine. Severely hypoxic climbers lost directional orientation entirely, their brains unable to distinguish the correct route from open mountainside. They wandered with the conviction of someone who believed they were heading exactly where they needed to go. There were no other climbers near Kevin at that hour. He was among the last to summit that day. He was alone on a section of Everest where being alone meant being dead. And I want to remind you, he chose this. Every single person told him not to go. Radio traffic that afternoon carried a fragmented report. A climber had been spotted off the standard route above the south summit, moving slowly across terrain that led nowhere survivable. The report came from a team on the Lhotse face who had observed the figure through binoculars. Solo, red and black suit. The description matched Kevin. The message reached Camp 4 where Jiangbu, who had arrived with Ethan after hours of painful descent on a shattered knee, heard it. Kevin was alive but lost on the upper mountain, with no oxygen, no support, and no route back. I can't imagine what Jiangbu was feeling hearing that radio call. No rescue was possible. The altitude, the hour, and the deteriorating weather made any attempt suicidal. A storm moved across the upper mountain in the late afternoon, bringing wind that exceeded 40 miles per hour and visibility near zero. Somewhere in that whiteout, Kevin Langford sat down in the snow. At extreme altitude, in a storm, with no oxygen and a body past every limit, sitting down was almost always the final act. The cold took what the altitude had already claimed. Kevin's body was found by a search team 2 days later, seated in the snow, approximately 300 feet off the standard southeast ridge route. He was facing upward toward the summit. The peak he had reached only hours before was visible from where he sat, though whether he could still see it in his final moments was something no investigation could determine. He died from hypothermia, compounded by severe cerebral hypoxia. Kevin Langford was 46 years old and still had so much to live for. Out of every story I've researched for this channel, the image image of him sitting there, facing the peak he just stood on, is one I don't think I'll ever forget. Ethan Langford was evacuated by helicopter the following morning. He survived with a fractured left forearm and severe frostbite that resulted in the partial amputation of 2 fingers on his left hand. He was 18 years old. Yangbu Lakba's knee required reconstructive surgery in Kathmandu, torn ligaments that would never meet the demands of extreme altitude work again. 12 summits and an 18-year career on the mountain ended on the lots he faced because he chose to carry someone else's son to safety. That right there is why I have so much respect for the Sherpas in these stories. The expedition company later recognized and awarded Yangbu for his decision to override Kevin's instructions and bring Ethan down immediately, a choice that almost certainly saved the boy's life. When the story reached climbing forums and news outlets, the response was overwhelming. Thousands praised Yangbu as the only person on that mountain who made the right call when it mattered. No charges were filed. Within the climbing community, the incident settled into the long catalog of cautionary stories about summit fever, about what happens when the mountain becomes more important than the people on it, and about the cost of dragging someone else into an obsession they never asked to carry. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's that the summit was never the problem. The problem was a man who made everyone around him pay for something the mountain was never going to fix. We're ending on September 29th, 2016. Trolltunga Trail, Hordaland County, Norway. Trolltunga, Troll's Tongue, is a near horizontal slab of rock jutting out from a cliff face roughly 3,600 feet above the Ringadalsvatnet Lake below. And if you've seen photos of it, you already know exactly why people make the trip. At the trailhead that morning, the air sat at around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, partly cloudy, light wind. Hold that image, mild, manageable, a perfectly reasonable morning to start a hike. That's what made it easy to keep walking. Mira Therer, 26, was a graduate student from Austin, Texas, midway through a master's program in environmental studies. She'd taken a 2-week break between semesters to travel through Scandinavia, and Trolltunga was the fixed point she'd built the entire itinerary around. Found through a wave of blog posts and Instagram photographs circulating widely through 2015 and into 2016. And that's a number worth stopping on for a second because in 2010, this trail had roughly 800 visitors for the entire year. By 2016, that number was over 80,000. That's not growth. That's an explosion, driven almost entirely by social media. And the safety infrastructure didn't come anywhere close to scaling with it. No mandatory equipment check at the trailhead. No ranger station there in the morning. You just showed up and started walking. Mira departed at approximately 7:20 a.m., wearing jeans, a light fleece jacket, and non-waterproof trail running shoes. No waterproof outer layer, no insulating base layer, no emergency bivouac, no satellite communication device. 1 water bottle, a phone, a small day pack. I don't say that to make her sound careless. I say it because that's exactly what someone who hasn't hiked in those conditions before would pack. It sounds like enough until it isn't. A trail camera at the 4-mile mark recorded her passing at 9:38 a.m., moving steadily, weather still clear. A regional weather advisory had been issued that morning for the Hardanger Fjord area. Rapid deterioration at elevation expected after midday. 2 hikers who turned back at mile 6 reported the sky shifting noticeably as they came down. They didn't pass Mira on the descent, which means she'd already moved past that point and was pushing toward the summit. She reached the Trolltunga outcrop at approximately 12:05 p.m. There's a time-stamped photo from the summit on her phone, and that photo existing is one of those details I find genuinely difficult to think about, because it means everything was fine at 12:05. She made it. She got the shot. She turned around, and then at approximately 12:25 p.m., the front came in from the northwest. Temperature dropped an estimated 17 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit in under 30 minutes. Wind accelerated to sustained gusts of 35 to 42 miles per hour. Light rain transitioned to sleet within about 40 minutes. And here's something I didn't fully understand before researching this. Dry cotton and dry fleece provide some insulation. But once those fabrics saturate, they stop working entirely and start pulling heat away from your body. In sub-35 degrees Fahrenheit air with 40 miles per hour wind on an exposed ridgeline, hypothermia onset can begin within 30 to 45 minutes. There's no shelter on that section of the trail. You're just on the ridge with whatever you brought. Between miles 4 and 9 on the return trail, there's no cell signal. Mira's phone last pinged GPS at mile 7.2 at 3:22 p.m. Nothing after that. I've looked at where that point sits on the trail map, and it's about as exposed and isolated as it gets on that route. She didn't return to her accommodation that evening. A welfare check was raised the following morning by hostel staff. And I think about that detail, that it was hostel staff who flagged it, because it speaks to how alone she was out there. No group, nobody tracking her timeline in real time. Mountain rescue deployed at first light. A rescue helicopter cross-referencing her last GPS ping, and the trail camera timestamp located her at approximately 9:50 a.m., roughly 18 hours after her last recorded position. She was found approximately 180 feet off the marked trail, in a depression between two rock outcroppings at mile 7. Off the path, in a hollow. That's not a random detail. When hypothermia reaches a certain stage, your decision-making goes before your consciousness does, and the choices you make feel completely logical in the moment. Finding her 180 feet off the trail tells you exactly where she was in that process. I read that part of the report a few times before I fully understood what it was actually saying. Cause of death confirmed as hypothermia. Clothing and equipment wholly inadequate for conditions at elevation. The Norwegian Trekking Authority introduced mandatory equipment checkpoints at the Trolltunga trailhead for the 2017 season, the season after Mira, and after 2 other hypothermia incidents that same year. 3 people in 1 season before anyone put a checkpoint at the trailhead. I've been sitting with all 5 of these cases for a while now, and that's the thread that runs through every single one of them. The fix was always there. It just wasn't in place yet. It was May 12th, 2015, on the Greek island of Kalymnos, where the late afternoon light fell clean across the limestone, and a Romanian mechanic with no rope and no harness was about to climb roughly 30 feet up a wall he had spent the day watching other people climb. Doran Mavrek was 31 and worked at an automotive shop in Bucharest, repairing diesel engines for nearly a decade. He had saved for months for this trip. A week of beaches and tavernas, something far removed from engine grease and long shifts. Kalymnos had come up in conversation with a coworker who visited the previous year. Doran had no climbing background and no technical interest in the sport. Friends said he likely just wanted sun and cold beer. By late afternoon, Doran had spent several hours drinking at a cafe near the base of a well-trafficked sport climbing sector, watching climbers work routes through the day. Just before 6 p.m., he walked down to the base of one of the sector's popular beginner lines, where a small group of climbers were resting between attempts. The wall at this sector rises roughly 80 feet, gray-white limestone studded with pockets and edges worn smooth by years of use. Kalymnos limestone is notoriously abrasive, and the pockets climbers rely on often measure less than an inch in depth. Doran told the nearby climbers he only wanted to try it a little, then started up the wall still wearing his flip-flops before anyone responded. Grip on these features degrades rapidly in untrained hands under real load, sometimes within seconds of full body weight. The cliff base is broken ground, compacted earth interrupted by irregular ledges and fractured limestone blocks jutting out at uneven heights. 2 climbers pulled out a phone and began recording almost immediately. The footage shows Doran moving with surprising initial ease, pulling through large pockets in the route's lower section. He reaches approximately 25 to 30 feet off the ground in under 2 minutes. The wall steepens slightly just beneath a small overhang at that height, and rather than continuing upward, Doran begins moving laterally across the face. The shift is clear on the video. He swings his left foot out toward a small foothold and transfers most of his body weight onto his right hand, set in a shallow pocket. His body hangs fully suspended on that single grip, legs pushing outward in opposite directions. Witnesses later told emergency responders they could see his fingers visibly straining from where they stood on the ground. His hand holds for approximately 3 seconds before his fingers slip from the shallow pocket under his full body weight. No sound, no warning, just the sudden loss of friction against the polished limestone. Doran falls feet first. He drops the full 25 to 30 feet before his lower body strikes a protruding rock ledge at the cliff base. The impact rotates him sideways mid-fall, turning his torso toward the rock. and he tumbles and rolls across a broken series of limestone blocks for another 10 feet before coming to rest. The phone camera captures everything with noticeable shaking and shouts from people nearby. Several climbers are already running toward him before he stops moving. One climber called local emergency services at 6:04 p.m. Island medical responders arrived approximately 18 minutes later by road from the main harbor clinic. Death was pronounced at the scene by responding medical personnel. The coroner's summary noted that Doron Mavrek sustained lethal blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from significant height onto rocky, irregular terrain. Primary findings included a fractured skull with subdural hemorrhage, bilateral rib fractures, and a fractured sternum, consistent with a direct chest impact against rock during the fall, with associated internal chest injury. Cause of death was determined as severe combined head and chest trauma. The incident received a brief mention on a regional climbing forum and a short item in a local Greek news outlet. The report did not publish his full name. The climbers who witnessed it gave statements to local authorities and turned over the footage to authorities. Some departed the island within days. Doron's body was repatriated to Romania. No formal safety review of the sector was conducted. The route he partially climbed was in use again the following morning.